Good evening. I'm Beth Finnerty, President and CEO of Skyland Trail. Welcome to the 2020 Dorothy C. Fuqua Lecture Series. This is an annual event that was established in 2010 in honor of Mrs. Dorothy C. Fuqua, a longtime board member and a great friend of Skyland Trails. I want to thank Dottie's son and daughter-in-law, Rex and Duvall Fuqua, and her close friends, Edwina and Tom Johnson, for making this important series possible. One of the goals of the lecture series is to bring the community together to learn about important topics in mental health and discuss positive changes we can all bring about together. This is our first year of a virtual lecture, and while we are not all together in the same room, this platform has allowed us to expand our community to friends and families across the country, with over 600 of you Zooming in tonight. What an opportunity for us to unite in support of individuals and families struggling with mental illness. As we are all well aware, anxiety within our world is running high right now. Social isolation, economic hardship, and concern for our safety and that of our families are affecting us all. Dire forecasts bombard the news, and there are a few ways to find social support or to maintain structure. People are reporting chronic levels of anxiety and stress, and emerging research is forecasting an increased need for mental health treatment and services in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. Tonight's panel presentation and discussion focuses on managing anxiety during these anxious times. We'll hear from three experts tonight about the neurobiology of anxiety, strategies we can all employ to manage stress and anxiety, and how effective treatment can help people experiencing disabling symptoms recover, heal, and thrive. After we hear from each of our speakers, we'll have time for questions and answers at the end of the discussion. Throughout the lecture, please submit any questions you have via the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, and I will help the speakers address as many of your questions as possible at the end of the session. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers for the evening. Dr. Ray Kotwicki is the Charles B. West Chief Medical Officer at Skyland Trail. Dr. Barbara Coffey is Professor and Chair of the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences and the Division Chief of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine. And Dr. Coffey is also a member of the Skyland Trail National Advisory Board. And Dr. Ben Hunter, who is Medical Director of Outpatient Services at Skyland Trail. Dr. Kotwicki, I'll turn things over to you now.
Well, thank you, Beth, and good evening, everybody. It's really my privilege to be involved with an organization like Skyland Trail that uses science and evidence in crafting and delivering our clinical services. And tonight, I would like to start our discussion off with just that, using science to inform what we think of as the implications of stress and anxiety, as well as what we know are evidence-based interventions to help both adults and children and adolescents manage their anxiety. So in an introductory kind of statement, anxiety just isn't inside your head. It affects your entire body, and it's something that we need to take very seriously during this pandemic. To begin, I want to start with some working definitions. Anxiety really is worry about the future and what is going to happen with uncertain outcomes. Fear, on the other hand, is an emotional response to real or perceived threat. It's vital to survival because fear makes sure that we don't do things that put us at risk and in harm's way. And stress is the adaptive response to a challenge or demand, which includes physiologic changes. So anxiety might be something that starts in your brain, but it really affects every other aspect of your physical and emotional well-being. Next slide, please. That said, anxiety isn't bad in and of itself. And just because people are experiencing anxiety, it doesn't mean that people have an anxiety disorder. This is a curve that shows there's an optimal level of anxiety where people have enough motivation to get up and do things throughout the day, but not so much anxiety that they become paralyzed and unable to cope with things in their environment. So anxiety isn't a pejorative term in and of itself, but how people manage it and respond to it can certainly create problems. Next slide, please. When people are exposed to chronic stress or anxiety that becomes disabling, we know that it is challenging on certain levels pathophysiologically. But what people make out of their experience and the existential understanding of why they're experiencing anxiety and stress is also a determinative factor in whether or not people develop an anxiety disorder. When anxiety disorders emerge, changes occur in the brain and in the endocrine system and in other parts of your body, which determine what illnesses might result from the presence of chronic anxiety in somebody's life. Next slide, please. So I want to introduce you to the first and probably most important part of the brain when we think about anxiety and anxiety disorders, which is the amygdala. And the amygdala is the red small structure pictured on this schematic of a brain. And when it turns on, it only allows people to do one of three things. You can fight, you can freeze, or you can flee. And by definition, those are things that are evolutionarily advantageous because they keep you from dying or from having bad things happen to you. But they also necessarily shut off the other part of your brain called the cortex, which is involved in higher level thinking and executive planning and other things that are not vital when somebody's in the middle of a crisis situation. Next slide, please. So this is a graph of what happens when your amygdala is activated. And if you can see here, the amygdala is the round circle in the middle of this diagram. So if you start at the top left, when somebody sees or hears or feels something that's scary, the stimuli go into a part of your brain through whatever the organ is that's picking up the stimulus, called the thalamus. And the thalamus relays information both to the amygdala and the part of your brain that's involved in regulating your emotions, called the prefrontal cortex. Ideally, the prefrontal cortex controls the amount of activity in somebody's amygdala. So if you see something that's scary in the environment and you recall that even though you are afraid of spiders, the last time you were at the zoo, you saw a spider and it didn't do anything to you, your prefrontal cortex should remind your amygdala that even though you're afraid of spiders, you're not in as an acute of a dangerous situation all the time. That also is contextualized by memories in part of your brain called the hippocampus. And so through memories and contextualization and whether or not something is relevant to feeling anxious, ideally your brain tampers down what activity is going on in your amygdala. But when your amygdala is activated, it regulates a lot of other parts of your body. One thing it does is that it changes the activity in something called your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal system, or your HPA system. And for those of you who have heard of the hormone cortisol, that's what system regulates the overall amount of cortisol in somebody's system, and we'll talk about that in a second. We also know that the amygdala regulates other parts of your brain, including a system called the dopamine system, which is regulated and involved in how somebody experiences feelings, including pleasure. We also know that the amygdala changes what happens in somebody's immune system, in somebody's metabolic system, and even in somebody's cardiovascular system. So in summary, when somebody has chronic overdrive of their amygdala activity, that positions people to have trouble fighting off infections like COVID-19. It changes the way that your body regulates glucose and energy, and it positions people in a risk for having problems like heart disease and high blood pressure. Next slide, please. So when trouble emerges, we know that certain things can result in overactivation of the amygdala. There could be a reduction in the threshold that is necessary to engage your amygdala. There can be exaggerated activity in the amygdala due to constant firing, like not knowing if it's safe to go out of your home for 8 weeks, just as a hypothetical example. And finally, we know that when there's failure of the cortex or the hippocampus to dampen activity of the amygdala, the sum result is that called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Next slide, please. And this is a busy diagram, but when the hypothalamus is overactive and it produces via the anterior pituitary an excessive amount of the stress hormone cortisol, you can see that lots of things happen that we would not be able to withstand forever. It changes your ability to reproduce, it changes your liver function, it changes what happens with your musculoskeletal system, your cardiovascular system, and your immune system. And interestingly, we're learning that cortisol over time actually causes a redistribution of fat cells. And so adipocytes are what we call fat cells. And when somebody is exposed to chronic stress with hypercortisol levels in their system for a long period of time, fat cells actually pick up and they move away from somebody's arms and their legs, and they relocate to the center of somebody's gut. And when people start developing what we call central obesity, it really puts folks in a high-risk situation for other medical problems, including heart disease, hypertension or high blood pressure, and unfortunately, increased morbidity and mortality. Next slide, please. So we know that cortisol changes the way that lots of things happen in somebody's system. It changes the way that you use energy. It changes how your immune response is activated when it is necessary to fight an infection. It changes your ability to pay attention to what's going on in your environment. And also, it changes how your brain lays down new memories. And then finally, as this sort of diagram shows with the sad face, excessive levels of cortisol related to unremitting stress and anxiety actually decreases serotonin. And for those of you who have a background in psychiatry or you know anything about mood and anxiety disorders, a decrease in the overall amount of serotonin in somebody's brain is associated with both depression and anxiety. Next slide, please. So while anxiety and stress in and of itself isn't a bad thing, because it gets us to do things that we otherwise might not be able to do, we know that when the fear neurocircuitry falls out of balance and people become disabled because they're paralyzed with excessive amounts of anxiety, that's when we start to see anxiety disorders develop. We know that anxiety disorders themselves can cause a lot of problems because people might be so anxious that they stop doing what their roles require of them, but they also result in significant physical and neuroanatomic changes. These are potential points for intervention. And so as I turn the talk over to Dr. Barbara Coffey, I want to remind you that this is a very well understood sort of pathophysiology within science. And the good news is because we understand why anxiety can produce so many physical and emotional problems, we also have other ways to intervene and to treat anxiety disorders, which is very possible using evidence-based interventions. So with that, I'd like to introduce again Dr. Barbara Coffey, who's going to talk about anxiety in children and adolescents. Dr. Coffey.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? I first want to thank Beth and Dr. Kotwicki for inviting me to participate in this wonderful series. It's truly an honor to be on the advisory board, and I welcome the opportunity to speak with the group. Anxiety has many faces, as you can see. There is anxiety in the classroom, there's anxiety about performance, there's anxiety about how you do with your peers when you're a child. I think we can all remember times as children when we worried about the monster under the bed or in the closet. So let's talk about the difference between fears and anxiety. As Dr. Kotwicki laid the ground for this, anxiety is very common, it's ubiquitous in various situations, and it differs from fears. Remember that fears and anxiety are common in healthy children as they grow up. In fact, part of the tasks of development is to learn how to master your anxiety as you grow and develop. So thinking in a developmental context, we look at ages. And so the very young child, the 3 to 5 year old, might experience anxiety around the first separation from parents when the child goes off to preschool or kindergarten for the first time. Mastery of that anxiety is very important to the child. By the time the child reaches school age, competence and learning how to control oneself and how to get along in the classroom and to get along with peers becomes very important. And so from this point of view, performance anxiety can become an issue that needs to be mastered by children. By the time children reach anxiety, as you know, there are many, many different feelings and emotions and demands that are placed upon them, particularly socially, when the task of adolescence is to learn how to relate to others in a successful way. And so parents wisely understand that kids need to navigate these developmental tasks and to manage them as they grow up. And so from the developmental perspective, here are some common fears in childhood. The very young infant is afraid of loud noises, being startled, strangers. The toddler who's beginning to emotionally and psychologically separate from the parent might be afraid of the dark, worried about imaginary creatures, sleeping alone, and of course, often the first exposure to the doctor's visit in the white coat, which can create a lot of anxiety. In school-age children, in addition to worries about competence and performance, worries about becoming injured, natural disasters can sort of kick in. And then, as mentioned earlier, older children and adolescents begin to worry about their school performance, their social competence, and their own and others' health. So certainly in the time of COVID, there are worries that go along normally that can be exaggerated and accelerated with the pandemic. So it's important for parents to understand, when does normal anxiety become a problem? And then we need to look at dimensions of anxiety and sort of duration and types of symptoms. So a persistent unrealistic fear or worry that's inappropriate for a developmental stage is a red flag. The child who was perfectly able to separate from parents in preschool and school age suddenly as a preteen begins to be unable to leave home and feel very anxious. That's a concern. The child who suddenly needs excessive need for reassurance, not just you're doing okay, but asking over and over again, is this okay? Is this okay, to the parent? Avoidance or significant distress with age-appropriate interests or activities is another red flag. The child who was a wonderful, involved soccer player is suddenly not wanting to play soccer anymore. The child who loved math and schoolwork, who's suddenly beginning to avoid doing problems or not do well, is a red flag. And then very common in children, and this to some degree differentiates kids from older people, are physical complaints. A child may not have the words to describe worry or anxiety or fear, but may instead have a headache, a stomach ache, body aches and pains, trouble sleeping, or a change in appetite. So physical complaints and changes in physical status are important to keep an eye on. And then, of course, in children and adolescents, this is true for adults as well, but particularly for kids, trouble with sleeping, either falling asleep, staying asleep, or for kids, the child who's been able to sleep alone in his or her own bed for several years is suddenly coming into the parent's bedroom every night with worry. So that's another important flag to keep in mind. Difficulty with concentration and attention. This can translate into problems with school performance. And then interference with school, social, or family functioning. The child who no longer wants to be connected with his playmates. Obviously, we're now in an age of social distancing. We recommend that children stay connected with their friends through virtual play dates, but the child who suddenly doesn't want to do that anymore, that's a concern. And then time-consuming symptoms, the child who's worrying day and night, the child who may have had a few habits or compulsions who's now compulsively repeating, checking the doors, checking for parents' health, and so on. Those are all red flags that we really need to watch out for. So what do you do to help the child manage anxiety, particularly in this time of COVID? It's very important, and to some degree, these can be guidelines for adults and all of us as well, to kind of manage the stressful time that we're in. Keeping a daily structure and a daily routine is very important. Parents are now not only managing to work at home on Zoom all day or other platforms, but also working with their children to make sure they get their homework done. So keeping a structure, not just for the child, for the whole family, and trying to abide by that in a regular way will help a child learn how to manage anxiety. And of course, encouraging a healthy lifestyle. When you're worried about if your friend is going to be sick, or when the adult is worried about going back to work and whether they can go out and shop for groceries, maintaining a healthy lifestyle, making sure you get enough sleep, making sure you get daily exercise. You can, in most communities, go out and walk. You have to keep your social distance, but that is a good routine. Doesn't require a lot of equipment or expense. Maintaining that daily exercise is extremely important. Having nourishing foods, a healthy diet. This is a good time to make sure that kids are eating well and eating in a healthy way. Most importantly, maintaining connections with friends and family. Even though we call it social distancing, and actually we should be talking about physical distancing, because our social connections become so important during this time, especially since we're all sheltering at home or in quarantine, or our friends or family are in quarantine. Very important to maintain those connections through online and virtual means. And of course, I don't think there's a need to really emphasize this, but reducing media exposure, even for adults. Look at the news once a day, read one newspaper, don't overdo it. There can be too much, and as Dr. Kotwicki was saying, that could flood you physiologically with cortisol, which we know is not a healthy thing. With children in particular, it's important to not overload children with information. So we recommend that you deal with questions on a need-to-know basis. You don't have to tell the child what's going on. Some basic knowledge about why you're staying in and why you have to wear a mask is helpful, but handle those questions as they come up for the child, and don't provide too much information that is not necessary. And then most importantly, make sure you schedule regular times for fun and recreation. If it's a board game, if it's just a time to sing together or to go out for a walk together, make sure that you build fun and recreation into your daily schedule. And then last but not least, if you're worried about your child or adolescents, if any of these signs have come up, first recommendation is to contact your pediatrician, talk it over, have a remote visit, and make sure that the symptoms can be addressed. So I want to thank you very much for your attention. And with that, I will turn this over to Dr. Ben Hunter, who will talk about managing anxiety in leaders and adults.
Thank you, Dr. Coffey, and thanks to everyone for joining us tonight. I have the task of talking about managing anxiety in leaders. And whether you've thought about it or not, everyone on this webinar tonight and everyone viewing is a leader in some capacity, formally or informally, in a more or less structured environment. And what I'll try and show tonight is that thinking about organizational leadership techniques and principles is a great way to reduce anxiety in ourselves, and thereby reduce anxiety in the organizations we lead, and hopefully help promote good outcomes in those organizations, whether it's a company or a family. Okay, next slide. So again, if we broadly define what it means to have an organization, we can think about our traditional businesses and Fortune 500 companies and large organizations. We can think about families, or we can think about just shared interest groups. your weekend golf foursome or your book club, or even just a group of friends. One of the aspects that great organizations have in common is that they have leaders who recognize their role in leadership, and also the membership recognizes who the leaders are and what the leadership structure is. Next slide. And traditionally, great leaders thrive on a healthy relationship with control. And one of the main themes we have seen emerge, especially in a situation that's so uncertain, like the COVID epidemic, is that it's been increasingly difficult to maintain a sense of control personally and in terms of our outside environment. But again, great leaders maintain an internal locus of control, even in challenging situations. And what that means is not that they micromanage or that they take a tyrannical approach to managing their organizations, but they do accept responsibility and ownership for their organizations, and particularly for their own contributions and responses to stresses. There are some traditional healthy sources of control that these leaders often look to, one of which is information flow, both the information they consume and the information they portray to their organization. Another is structure, so their own daily structure, the structure they create within an organization. And then another is just basic elements of behavior, and especially consistent behavior. The things they do every day to maintain their own health, the health of their organization, and how those things kind of fit together. So again, COVID directly challenges our control structure. We are, in the most direct sense, in a situation we can't control in many aspects. But what a great leadership structure will maintain is a sense of control of our response to the epidemic and to the challenge. Again, great leaders innovate, and they find innovative ways to reestablish a feeling of control within themselves and within their organization, even though they recognize the fact that a lot of the external factors that are affecting us are not within their control. Next slide. Let's start with information. So again, this starts by a leader supplying themselves with high quality information, and then thinking critically and carefully delivering that information to their organization. The information should be accurate, concise, and clear. Never more relevant than now. I think it's important to think about the quality of the information and the concept that more information is not necessarily better information in terms of what we consume and what we deliver to the people who depend on us for that information. So sticking with high quality sources, and perhaps thinking about obtaining enough information to understand a concept, but not so much that it becomes overwhelming. Again, one of the key principles we can employ is to never sacrifice accuracy for clarity. In many complex situations like the one we're going through, the tendency is to want to simplify concepts in order to understand them and promote a feeling of again, control over the situation. So for example, one of the less helpful responses you might have heard in the last few months has been, well, this coronavirus situation it's just going to blow over in a couple months, and if we just go about our business, things will be okay. That is an extremely clear and simple answer to this problem. It is unfortunately not an accurate answer. And if you look at that type of response and that information, if provided to an organization, the actions on which that they will enact on behalf of that information would not be timely, would not be effective in managing the situation we've come to deal with. Next slide. And again, another aspect we can look at as a good kind of healthy source of control, again, given a lack of control over the environment, is the structure of our day. I use the term mirroring the normal very intentionally because this is not a normal situation. We should not go about business as usual. What we should do is try and make our days look like our days before this all started, or in the face of any challenge, try to mirror what we normally do that has created success over time. So it's about creating a daily schedule. It's about creating boundaries in time and space. Not working past business hours too far if it's not necessary, just because you're at home and you're having a hard time distinguishing between work time and home family time. Using spaces that you've created for business and work, and not letting that overflow into your family space or your personal space. and trying to establish the same methods of communication and the same frequency of communication with the people you communicate with on a regular basis. In other words, trying to avoid interruptions during your workday, but also, again, not allowing work to intrude too much on your free time and your social time. One of the things that can be very challenging is to create a sense of purpose in an epidemic that feels like it's long-lasting and kind of monotonous and never-ending here. I think that if we go about each day intentionally generating goals and purpose for the day, we can take small steps that will lead us towards successful outcomes regardless of the length of this epidemic. And also what's really important, though, is to recognize limitations of the situation. This is not just working from home. This is attempting to work from home as effectively as possible in the middle of a crisis. And I think recognizing it as such is important in terms of what we expect from ourselves. You know, we want to be as productive as possible, but expecting things to go exactly as they did before all these precautions were put into place is not realistic, and it will not lead to better results. And the other thing I think is that's really important to keep in mind is that there is going to be strain on relationships as a result of being isolated and having to use different communication techniques with people than we would normally employ. So to remember that it's not necessarily a flaw in a relationship if you're starting to get on each other's nerves. It may just be the fact that you've been isolated with someone for a month and a half at this point. Next slide. And finally, I think one extremely critical aspect of establishing a feeling of control in a healthy way is regulating our behavior. And what this really comes down to, just like any other crisis or challenge and its best management, it usually comes back to doing the fundamentals well. You know, are you getting 7 or 8 hours of sleep at night if it's possible, or as much high quality sleep as you can? Are you paying attention, as Dr. Coffey mentioned, to good nutrition, a well-rounded diet, and a good exercise program that allows you to move at least 3 or 4 or 5 times a week and keep your body healthy, regulating all those axes that Dr. Kotwicki mentioned? Are you maintaining your faith and your sense of spirituality, whether that's in an organized way or in a personal sense? Are you doing things that bolster that relationship? And are you maintaining social connections, whether it's in, you know, again, a personal in-person format with folks who you've been quarantined with and making sure those are healthy, or if it's reaching out in more remote ways to the friends you haven't spoken with in a while or other important people in your lives, making sure you nurture those relationships as well. Some of the common pitfalls we'll face behaviorally, self-medication, and I think there's multiple factors that can contribute to an increased level of self-medication in this setting, one of which is that we're just home a lot more typically. We have access to particularly alcohol and drugs and other ways of medicating ourselves that are less healthy more than we would in our typical scenario. And what I can say is that as much as these sometimes feel like they're quelling the anxiety, they unfortunately lead to a vicious cycle of increased anxiety and then unfortunately sometimes increased use in a way that gets out of control and creates more problems. Another mistake is putting life and the healthy habits you've employed for years on hold in the setting of an epidemic. You know, you sometimes hear the mentality that, you know, we'll get back to normal once this is over. We'll start to, you know, go back to those habits, you know, once coronavirus is handled and once we've got a hold on this. That's a mistake. And finally, neglecting other aspects of your mental and physical health. You know, assuming that every mental health issue you have right now is related to COVID or anxiety. You know, in many cases, it may be another issue kind of cropping up, and depression is one we think about, you know, very quickly, given how many of the things we're forced to do in terms of our daily behaviors have been changed, and how some of the things that sometimes help us avoid depression are unfortunately becoming tough to continue in this setting. So I would urge everyone, as Dr. Coffey mentioned, to check in with your consultants regularly. You know, that's your psychiatrist or your mental health provider if you're experiencing depression or anxiety and you've been treated. Maybe it's reaching out to a new provider via telehealth or other mechanisms if you haven't ever access to a provider. Your general practitioner or your specialist for medical issues too. I mean, watch your blood pressure, watch all the other systems that are affected by anxiety, as Dr. Kotwicki outlined, and make sure you're touching base, probably even more now than ever. And I know it's challenging given the dearth of appointments available, at least at the outset of this epidemic. But what we know now is that telehealth has become much more widespread and in some ways relatively easy to access. So don't necessarily assume that you won't have access to your providers. Next slide. And finally, I think, you know, reframing in an accurate and healthy way is one of the most critical aspects of psychotherapy. And, you know, there's, again, a great opportunity to reframe this scenario as one that we can all grow through. And, you know, at the end of the day, This is a situation that we're all managing together. And while there will be unfortunate consequences of this epidemic, what we know is that many positive things are happening as well. We are developing new ways of communicating and maintaining relationships, and we're finding new ways to appreciate each day. And I think at the end of the day, great leaders and organizations really grow through these challenges. And if you can keep that in mind when you're managing your own anxiety and that of your organization, big or small, you can see this as an opportunity to really come closer together than ever, and maybe to generate a new level of success after this epidemic, and even during it, that you've never expected. So thank you all again for your time, and I think now we'll move to our Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. Kotwicki, Dr. Coffey, and Dr. Hunter for those presentations. And I want to thank everyone who's been sending in questions to our Q&A. Keep them coming. We've got a lot of great questions, and I'm going to just take a few of these and throw them out to our speakers. Let's start with one of Dr. Kotwicki's favorite topics, which is sleep. Question from one of our audience members: can you comment more on the importance of good sleep hygiene for managing anxiety?
Yeah, and just to be clear, it's not only that I like to sleep, it's that I think sleep is so important from a mental health and a physical health point of view. There's really interesting new research that is actually coming out of Yale right now, and Dr. Atkins, who's an immunologist, did a really fascinating experiment from my point of view, where he inoculated rats with the flu virus, actually. And then half of the group of rats he sleep deprived, another half of the group of rats he let sleep, and he looked to see what happened in terms of the rat's ability to fight off the flu down the road. And it took 3 nights of not getting good rat sleep. And at that point, the rats that did not have sleep looked as though they never had the vaccination toward the flu. And so in terms of the COVID pandemic, if we're doing all these other things to avoid getting infected, and if somebody is infected, to recover successfully from the infection, sleep is really, really crucial in developing what we consider to be memory immunity. And so from a purely physiologic point of view, sleep is important to be able to mount an immune response that could prevent, in this case, a viral infection. We also know that in general terms, outside of a pandemic, sleep is necessary to form new memories and to consolidate learning. In fact, when people are sleeping and they go through the appropriate stages of sleep, through deep stages in REM where people dream, somebody's brain actually shrinks in volume by about 20%. And that sounds initially like a bad thing, but it's really a good thing, because what happens when your brain shrinks during sleep is that the unnecessary connections between brain cells are cut, so that the connections that link patterns and help people develop themes and more sophisticated thoughts can become more firm. And that's really how people develop sophisticated cognition. So across the board, sleep is really crucial in developing memories of all kind, including memory immunity that hopefully will lead to not getting infected with things like COVID-19 in the future.
Thank you, Dr. Kotwicki. This next question I'm going to direct to you, Dr. Coffey, and you other guys may have some feedback on this as well, but a lot of the discussion here tonight has been on the physiology of anxiety and the impact on individuals at various stages of development. This is an especially tough time for young adults. What is your advice for the new graduates from high school and college who find their lives totally disrupted by this pandemic?
Yeah, that's a wonderful, wonderful question, and so relevant to what we're going through right now. Certainly the developmental phase, what we call the transitional age, from the late teens to the mid-20s, is a critical time in development anyway. For example, brain is developing, pruning is taking place. As Dr. Kotwicki was saying, some of the changes that take place normally and physiologically in the brain are augmented by good sleep and health and nutrition. So it's a crucial stage, and it's a crucial stage psychologically, meaning that now young people have to go through another emotional and psychological separation from their parents. leaving home for college or for the military, or even getting their own apartment and working in their own independent way for the first time. So from a physiological, brain development perspective, psychological, emotional, and social perspective, it's a critical phase. This is when typically relationships are solidifying, partners are being found over the next 10 years, 5 to 10 years. So even without COVID going on, it's a critical phase. What can facilitate development is kind of the acknowledgement of the stages and the landmarks. And certainly we all appreciate the importance of a high school graduation, of the senior prom, of the parties and the last opportunity for kids to be with their high school classmates over time, the importance of those as critical markers of developmental accomplishments. This has been totally disrupted by COVID. I think this is the first generation ever that's not had the opportunity to experience those important acknowledgements of the developmental tasks that have been mastered through late adolescence and early adulthood. So I think many high schools and families and organizations are trying to find creative ways of helping kids mark those landmarks, acknowledge those landmarks in a different way this year. And I've certainly encouraged my patients in this age group. We have a counseling center at our university to find innovative ways and creative ways, from virtual graduations. We just had a virtual graduation from a medical school this past Saturday, to I live in Coral Gables. We have signs on the street and pictures of the graduates in our community. So finding those alternative ways to mark those important milestones are very important.
Thank you, Dr. Coffey. Dr. Hunter, this is an interesting question I'm going to direct to you. Can you suggest ways of working with leaders whose response to the pandemic is to attempt to exert greater control, whether it be greater frequency in communication, disregarding time boundaries, i.e. Zoom calls in the evening, and micromanaging?
So I think the question is, how do you deal with a manager who is using those techniques to try and exert control? I'm a big fan of feedback and receiving it and giving it, I think. And in this setting, finding a way and maybe strategizing with other people you work with to communicate with the leaders in the organization what's helpful, what has been less helpful, what will help you, and sort of framing it in a way of what will help you as a worker perform at your best, I think is often the best way to frame it. So rather than saying, I hate when you micromanage me, it's, hey, if you could give me some broad strokes on what you'd like me to complete and kind of let me go after it, that might allow me a little more flow in my work, and I'll get you a better product. So I think in many cases, though, leaders don't realize how much they're micromanaging people underneath them. And so finding a creative way to let them know is the first step, I think. And, again, in depending how receptive they are to feedback, that can be challenging at times. But again, this is where we, a situation like this is where we need to be very creative.
Thank you. This is another great question. I'll throw it out there to any of you. I've been managing my own anxiety well, but it is harder to manage the anxiety of friends. Any thoughts on managing and being supportive to other people's anxieties and fears? Ray, Dr. Kotwicki?
Well, I think, words speak some, but behaviors are certainly much more impactful. And so in psychotherapy, we call it modeling, and doing things that other people can witness and see is a much more influential and direct way, ultimately, of getting somebody else to change their behavior. So I would ask myself, some rhetorical questions. How am I carrying myself when I'm around those friends who are over anxious or reacting in unhealthy ways to anxiety? Is there anything that I could do, not through saying, do something different through words, but through my behaviors that would demonstrate that there are better outcomes if people moderate their anxiety and approach things differently? I think this is particularly true, Dr. Coffey, I would imagine, with children, where parents and how primary caregivers react in tough situations really become the framework, either to maybe internalize for children who observe that, or perhaps the other end of the spectrum, and the other extreme would be to say, I'm totally going to reject the way that my parents did this and go out on my own path when I'm an adult. But I think that observable behavior is probably the key.
Yeah, I would say, to add on to that, that modeling is so important for children, no matter what the age. And the teenager may need to reject that just because they're trying to separate and they need to go in the opposite direction. But oftentimes that positive behavior will be internalized to use later on. And I think there's some evidence that when you are ruminating or you're struck with worry and anxiety, that it's very helpful in reducing that anxiety by doing for someone else, taking your mind off your own worries and helping out your neighbor, or giving some extra support to a friend or something like that. So there's a lot of positives in that kind of experience when you're anxious. Do for somebody else, be a little bit more altruistic, and that can reduce anxiety levels.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Kotwicki, I wanted to address this one to you. This has come up several times. Many medical offices are closed due to COVID. So how are mental health services being delivered to the growing number of people in need in our community?
It's a really important public health issue because we need mental health services now, really, quite frankly, more than ever. I am so proud that Skyland Trail has been able to remain open and keep treating our patients who really need this evidence-based, recovery-focused mental health care. But also it's important to keep people out of hospitals. And there are a paucity of beds in places that have been preparing for the worst, when people need to be admitted to the hospital and possibly put on a ventilator because they are sick with the COVID virus. So, I'm thrilled that we can not only provide direct care for the patients we're privileged to serve, but also do our part for the community so that we can keep hospitals open and available to treat people who need to be there. In my opinion, the people who regulate these things have done a couple of really helpful things. Number one, they have put a temporary moratorium on some of the laws that govern what people can do from a telemedicine or telepsychiatry point of view. Heretofore, we were unable as physicians licensed, for example, in Georgia, to do telemedicine and to provide recommendations and services for patients, even if we had a history of treating them, if a patient moved to a different state in which we did not have an active medical license. And that currently has been put on hold so that more telemedicine can be done. A second, just kind of practical example is that up until the pandemic, the platforms technologically that people could use in order to provide telepsychiatry or virtual therapy groups, which we're doing at Skyland Trail, had to be very well vetted and approved by regulation agencies within the government and within healthcare organizations to ensure that patients' privacy was maintained and that somebody wasn't able to hack in and hear a very private psychotherapy session. Well, I think privacy is crucially important and would never want to put that at risk intentionally. Using Zoom or meeting space or something else that up until recently wasn't available has become possible. And it really has just launched in an exponential way the number of people who can get services and remain connected to mental health care. So I think those are some positive changes, and I'm interested to see how the landscape of mental health care is actually going to remain changed if the pandemic, if and when the pandemic comes to a close, because I think we're seeing huge patient satisfaction doing things this way, that it increases our footprint and our ability to touch more lives. And maybe there are some really unpredicted benefits that we can retain in mental health services provision that would ultimately benefit everybody moving forward, even after the pandemic is over.
Yeah, to just add on to that, I think this is the one field in all of medicine that is most easily moved into telemedicine or telehealth. We barely skipped a beat in our university health system in terms of most of us had a video platform embedded in the HIPAA protected medical record. And so just switching patients to a remote version of their visit became very easy. We, like you, have found that satisfaction is great on behalf of our patients. The only patients who do seem to be more challenged is the older patients who aren't so comfortable with technology, but we're finding a way to work through that as well. So I think it's a wonderful thing, and it's really going to extend our access to people who would have to travel miles and miles to see us, who can now really reach us this way. So I think for mental health, this is going to be a real game changer.
I had a really interesting experience with a patient recently who was doing more good work in therapy with me. And I just kind of asked, what do you think changed, since all of this happened? I was expecting things not to be going so well. And his reply was interesting. He said, well, this is more familiar to me, and I don't have to sit 3 feet away from you and see all of the emotions on your face and what you're looking at while I'm talking with you about my private ideas. And so this is easier. I feel safer being, a little bit distance from you. And so ironically, it may produce some breakthroughs in therapy with patients who are more comfortable with this format.
Absolutely.
So many great questions. I'm going to run through a couple. Dr. Hunter, I'm going to ask this one to you. Besides alcohol, excessive sugar foods and beverages, and caffeinated beverages and foods, what would you recommend people avoiding to keep anxiety under control and stay healthy?
I think one that's been addressed already is, excessive media and news consumption. I think at this point, we're in a situation where, with a rapidly evolving, somewhat complicated situation, most of us are best off if we can get enough information to understand what's going on and communicate with the people that we need to communicate with, and not a whole lot more than that. I think, again, with numbers and recommendations changing, by the half day at this point, it's hard to feel like spending a great amount of time is really going to be relevant for more than a day or so. I think the other thing too, again, behavioral addictions like pornography, gambling, virtually especially, just watching and making sure that those types of habits, which have now become maybe a little bit easier to, to engage in, given that many people are home from work, don't take hold and disrupt the healthy habits that someone else otherwise maintaining.
Excellent. I want to go to this one, and it's a really lovely question. Please talk about the power of hope in our current situation, as opposed to the need for accepting where we are and not moving into a false optimism. We certainly all need hope. Who'd like to field that question first?
Well, I'll take a stab at it in a very hopeful kind of way, which is that, when people, and it's a fundamental tenet of a really good kind of psychotherapy is called cognitive behavioral therapy. And the idea is that how you think and how you feel and how you behave all affect one another. And so if you are behaving in a way that you don't like, you can change that by either thinking differently about the situation or changing how you feel about the behavior or the situation. And so, from a neuroanatomic, neurophysiologic point of view, when people have hopeful thoughts and really can internalize those thoughts of hope into future expectations of good things, it dampens the amygdala response and ultimately changes and decreases the level of the stress hormone cortisol that is coursing through our body. And so, if we're trying to combat all of the negative things that go along with anxiety disorders, changing the way that you think about something and ultimately having a more optimistic feeling about the future can really change behaviors that ultimately produce much better outcomes. So I think, it's a really important piece of the puzzle knowing that, especially I would imagine, again, Dr. Coffey, I'd love to hear your perspective on this, but helping children develop hope that leads to resiliency, so that adolescents know that they can survive things that in the here and now seem to be almost insurmountable, and that there's hope to get through that, and that there's a brighter day ahead, I think is really, in my opinion, really important for developing resilience. And ultimately, that's what I think we all want to do with adolescents and younger people, is to cultivate within them a sense of being able to make it through things that they otherwise wouldn't expect to be able to survive.
Yeah, there's an old Chinese proverb, the other side of crisis is opportunity. And I think if we think of this crisis as an opportunity, it does inspire hope. Another quote I just heard recently was, in terms of dealing with the pandemic, prepare for the worst, but don't hope for the best, work for the best. So in that hopeful feeling, you can translate into really what you were saying is working on your thoughts and your behaviors and things that you can do that really do promote resilience. Yes, we have no control over this, a la Dr. Hunter's nice discussion about what do you do when you don't have any control over things that are going on in the world. Well, you find ways of finding some control in modulated ways. And I think teaching children how to find control in a situation like this becomes very important in building hope. And in doing so, I think building resilience.
I'll capitalize on that. I think that, speaking about resilience and the ability to weather these types of storms, as opposed to the attempt to control and avoid these types of issues, is such a critical aspect of mental health. I'll never forget, I was giving a talk after an episode of school violence once, and one of the questions that was asked was, how do you as a psychiatrist prevent this from happening again? And my answer to that question was, of course we should do everything we can to help provide mental health services and screen people who are in need. But at the same time, I don't view my fundamental goal as preventing these issues from happening. I view my goal as a mental health professional as helping people feel resilient enough to deal with whatever stress comes into their life, because they will continue. There will be stressful events that come up for all of us, perpetually. And real hope, I think, often comes from the sense that no matter what happens, you can maintain who you are and a sense of optimism moving forward. So that's, I think, a great goal for our treatment.
Thank you all for your great responses to that question. And it looks like we are winding down our time. It looks like we have about 3 minutes left. Just a quick, I'm going to throw it out there to you guys. Where can folks, if they are suffering from anxiety and they're sort of in a downward spiral, resources or places that folks can go and get help? I think we were going to send something out after this talk about some resources for folks. I know you've all mentioned going to your provider, your pediatrician, if you will, your psychiatrist, psychologist, mental health professional. Anything else you want to add to that? Ray?
I would like to add, having meaningful conversations is a really important thing to do right now. And in my own life, and what I would recommend for everybody else is, with this extra time for some people and a little bit of extra pressure, not knowing quite what everybody's future holds, this is a great time to capitalize on making it a priority to have crucial conversations. And to let people know how you feel about them, and especially for those people who you really love, this is a perfect time to prioritize that inner connection and that interpersonal relation that I think helps all of us get through tough times. So short of having a disorder, again, anxiety in and of itself isn't necessarily bad, and in fact, it's ubiquitous. Using anxiety to propel you forward, to do things that maybe you've been putting off because you know that right now things seem a little bit more urgent and a little bit more pressing maybe than they ever have before. And it's a great time to capitalize on that, to have meaningful conversations with others.
And advice from a child psychiatrist: call your mother.
That's a great note to end on, Dr. Coffey. I want to thank Dr. Kotwicki, Dr. Coffey, and Dr. Hunter. I know we've all learned something that will help us take better care of ourselves, our loved ones, and the people in our communities. If you'd like to share this lecture with other people, we'll have the video posted on our website by the end of the week. Many of you have asked if you can get copies of the slides. I'm going to say yes to that, and we have all your email addresses. We'll get slides to you for those of you who wanted them. I also want to thank all of you in the audience for joining us this evening. I hope you'll stay connected to Skyland Trail via our website to learn more about future virtual education events and how you can support our clients and other individuals struggling with mental illness. You can also learn about how you can help, from sharing messages of support with our staff to making a charitable contribution to support our ever-important financial aid program. We have continued to operate and to serve our adult and adolescent clients in our treatment programs during this pandemic, while taking the CDC recommended precautions to mitigate the risks of the COVID-19 pandemic. Financial aid for our clients is needed now more than ever to help them access and complete their treatment. I hope that you and your families are all staying safe, healthy, and supported during these very turbulent times. We are all truly in this together, and I know that we'll get through it together as well. Thanks again for joining us. Good night, everybody.